So, how do we go from relatively egalitarian farming towns of the Near East during the Neolithic to the highly structured and highly unequal societies of urban Mesopotamia? A lot of this has to do with the rise of another new innovation in how people live. It's not the agricultural revolution. It's not a change in the crops that are being grown. It's a change in the relationships between people. It's a change in economics. It's a change that is every bit as momentous in terms of how it affected people in the past and how it continues to affect us today. And that's the emergence of the city. Again, back to the map that we've been looking at before. This is a pretty detailed map showing the distribution of the early farming villages at a little bit higher resolution than some of the maps that we looked at before. And you can see the Fertile Crescent from Egypt in the southwest up through southeastern Turkey and on and around through the Zagros Mountains of Iran. One thing that I want you to notice is that most of these early Neolithic villages are actually in the highlands and foothills around the margins. Most of these early towns are not in what properly becomes Mesopotamia. They're not in the same areas as these earliest cities, and that's something to keep in mind. You can see also on this map the distribution of wild wheat and barley and the distribution of wild lentils and peas through this area. So these people are still occupying many of the same zones that were occupied by their Natufian ancestors during the upper and latest periods of the Paleolithic. But they changed that ecological relationship. You can also see on this map the distribution of wild cattle and sheep and goats. The overlap of that zone is pretty consistently mirroring the same pattern of the Neolithic as well. But then we talked about before the collapse of the Neolithic, the changes in climate that meant people could no longer keep doing things the same way. They had to adjust and adapt their strategies. People didn't vanish, people didn't disappear, but the old way of doing things was no longer tenable. Some continued doing farming in smaller, more restricted areas of these foothills and highlands. Others became mobile pastoralists, and that period of decreased population density and decreased village occupation, town occupation, lasted for nearly 1,000 years before the emergence of the earliest periods of the Bronze Age. But what's interesting is that many of the largest sites, archaeological sites, that give us evidence for the earliest Bronze Age aren't within that original Fertile Crescent zone. They're actually in the river valleys of the Tigris and Euphrates to the west of the Zagros Mountains there. This is an artist's reconstruction of the temple at Eridu, which dates to 4500 BCE, or 6,500 years ago. And this is some of the stuff from the earliest time periods of the Bronze Age. And this is not an architectural structure or style that we saw at any of the Neolithic villages. This highly restricted access, where only certain members of society would have been able to enter this sacred precinct. Only certain members of society would have been able to participate directly in the rituals, and where this elevated place is obviously created as a stage, as a place for the performance of rituals that can be observed but not participated in directly by the vast majority of the population. One of the things that really becomes a significant factor of the patterns of new subsistence during the early Bronze Age is that rather than relying heavily upon dry land agriculture, which is dependent substantially on rainfall and small-scale irrigation, you see a dramatic increase in the amount of large-scale public works, right? Where the administration of things like irrigation ditches and fields and whatnot becomes something that is operating at a much higher level than just the individual farm or the individual community. You can see in the top right of this slide here an early cuneiform document showing a canal system with the different fields that are serviced by this canal system, their land area, which was carefully calculated because one of the things that the temple system did and the new form of social organization that emerges during this time period is that these public works like flood control walls and ditches and irrigation canals, that has to get paid for. Somebody has to build it. Somebody has to maintain it. And that maintenance isn't just about your farm, because your farm may be one of hundreds that are serviced by the same irrigation system. And so who's going to construct these large-scale public works? Well, in the case of the emerging patterns of the early Bronze Age, it's administered through the temple, through the state government of these cities that are emerging. And so the land area of these different fields was carefully calculated using geometry developed here initially before the Greeks expanded upon it in order to be able to calculate how much taxes the landowners had to pay to the temple, to the state, for the administration and maintenance of these canal systems. You also see the emergence of a ramping up of the agricultural systems. Instead of having relatively small-scale fields worked principally by human labor power, people are clearing them, people are planting the crops, people are harvesting the crops, all human power, right? You have the beginnings of an intensification. Here, one of the big factors was the development of the plow, yoked to farm animals. The first kind of agricultural, intensification that you can see where other strength, the strength of these cattle. It's the first tractor. And they even have, you can see illustrated in this picture at the bottom here, they had even developed an automatic seeding mechanism to go along with the plow. You pour the seeds down that funnel there, and it plants the furrow exactly at the same time as you plow it. And then so somebody comes along behind and kind of closes it up. So they were developing new technologies to be able to farm larger and larger areas and get more and more returns on their work. And this process is one that really carries forward. And as people are able to farm more and get more returns on their labor, you begin to have larger and larger populations. And those larger and larger populations then require more and more structured organization to society to maintain a cohesion within this system. And so you see the emergence of this new thing called the city. What is a city? A real city in an anthropological sense of the term. In a simplest definition, you can think about them as large, permanent settlements, highly nucleated. Settlements that are larger in area than villages, but that's not really enough, right? There must be more to it than that. key to this is that you have dense populations numbering in the thousands. But the cutoff of what makes a city is somewhat arbitrary. Different geographic regions and different historic time periods are going to place that threshold at different arbitrary numbers. For example, today, if you had a community that had 15,000 people living in it, we might hesitate to call that a city in the sense of compared to Los Angeles or Chicago or New York or Tucson or San Antonio, right? But in 5,000 years ago, a community of 15,000 people, there were probably a fair number of communities of 15,000 people that met that threshold. But really, in a much better way of looking at this are some other factors. First among those is you have high agricultural productivity and surplus, and territorial influence over other villages to acquire these surpluses. Very, very, very few cities, vanishingly small percentage of the cities that have existed throughout time have been actually self-sufficient, in the sense that they don't tend to produce an adequate amount of agricultural products within the boundaries of the city itself to sustain that population, right? Does Los Angeles produce enough food inside Los Angeles to feed everybody in Los Angeles? No. New York? No. Chicago? No. Paris? No. Moscow? No. None of these cities, produce enough food within their city boundaries to be able to sustain the populations that exist and live within them, which means that they're then dependent upon the productivity of the areas that surround them. And they have the population density and the markets and the politics to be able to extend that influence over these surrounding communities, whether by physical possession as part of a territory or by economic and political influence. Cities are also places where you see writing, art, and science. They are a hub for these things. They are the places where these things are consumed and produced, right? Both, in the highest amount. This is where you see multiple people working on different projects, and that meeting of the minds and the exchange of information happens at a much higher rate because people are in contact with more similar people working on similar kinds of things. If you have one village blacksmith working out in the middle of nowhere, he may come up with a great innovation. But if they're not around other blacksmiths to share that with, it may take a while for that new way of smelting iron to catch on. Meanwhile, in a city, if there's a new innovation like this, a new technological innovation, and there are a lot of other people producing similar kinds of products, it rapidly expands and lots more people start doing it if it's something that is highly productive. It's going to spread rapidly. And so you have a kind of a fermentation of all of these different factors interacting with each other in interesting and fascinating ways. And so it's one of the reasons why, after the emergence of the earliest cities, whenever that happens and wherever that happens, you see these rapid shifts in art and science and literature and whatnot tend to follow along. The rate of social change and technological change picks up when you see these settlement organizations take off. You see public monumental architecture, temples as administrative institutions, the emergence of sacred geography, right? These places where these temples are located, where these pyramids are built, where history for a people and a belief system have occurred, begins to map itself very specifically onto the geography in ways that become inherently integrated into the political system and the economic system and the belief system. And those things begin to merge into one another in pretty intensive ways. Sometimes you can say productive, sometimes you can say unproductive, but it's intense. And finally, and really, really the bottom line is that cities, to meet the definition of a city, they serve as political, religious, and administrative centers for a larger territory. They are a place where other regions, other smaller communities in the surrounding area have to depend on for the operation of political systems, for the places and structures of organized religious practice, and the administration of the economy. And you can see this in some ways in phrases like "all roads lead to Rome," right? And when a place is the administrative center, one of the ways we're able to see that sometimes in the archaeological record is by looking at the patterns of travel. And that can sometimes be literally finding the roadways that enter into and leave from these political centers, these economic centers. And sometimes you can track that by looking at the sources of raw materials and trade goods coming from other places. Where on the landscape in 5,000 years ago in an archaeological sense do we see these nexus? Where do we see the nexus of these economic systems? Where are the raw materials coming from and to? And these cities really, that's one of the ways they really do show up in the archaeological record, is you can see these are the places that things are being brought into and things are being produced in and then sent back out. And that differs from smaller communities in the hinterlands that may be producing raw materials or may be producing particular kinds of goods, but they're not the hub of the wheel in terms of looking at the political, religious, and economic administration of the area. And very often they're centers for markets and craft specialization, as we've been talking about. And very often, cities develop a strong sense of identity based upon residence in the city itself. Sometimes the walls around a city may reinforce this identity. And even today, we have this. We have sports teams from particular cities. We have people who are very proud to be from New York or Chicago, or very proud to be from Los Angeles, right? And this is something that even within a political system, of the United States here, there is a sense of identity and belonging to these places, even though sometimes they can be relatively spread out, as in our case, as in the case of Los Angeles, the Los Angeles area. It's a very different kind of thing from these ancient cities, but that idea of being part of these systems is something that still carries on today. And another thing that's often the case is that these cities are planned communities. There's a center, there's a layout to the streets, and even in instances where there is a failure by the political administrative powers within a city system to adequately provide for good roads and good drainage and public health and all of that, you can often make the case that is at least partly part of the plan in these instances, because the areas of the city that get the good drainage and the good roads and everything else tend to be the areas where you have the wealthiest, most politically influential residents, and the areas that don't get the same amount of attention are the places where you have the citizens that are least politically influential in terms of individual power, at least economically well off. And so even in those instances, there is a planning component to it. So the first cities in Mesopotamia are the ones that are in the sort of Ubaid period. You see some of these sites, but really it's the sites from the Uruk period, from about 4300 to 3100 BCE. These are the first cities. These are the cities that are being talked about in the Epic of Gilgamesh, right? Warka, Uruk, right down there in southern Mesopotamia, and located near, much closer to the Persian Gulf than it is today. You can see the ancient shoreline that would have been there during the time period of Uruk, because so much sediment has washed down the Tigris and Euphrates over the last 6,000 years that the Persian Gulf is getting smaller from the deposition of this delta sediment and sand. Because unlike the Mississippi and other rivers that flow out into the ocean along a relatively straight coastline and so form a delta, the Persian Gulf is restricted. And so as that delta, as that river sediment comes out, it can't spread left and right very far, and so it begins to fill in this narrow gulf. And so the Persian Gulf has actually gotten smaller, not because sea level has dropped, but because so much sediment from the surrounding mountain ranges has washed down. And this is an archaeological map of the site of Uruk. You can see the outline of the city walls and some of the main temple complexes there in the center portion of the city. These are the famous ziggurats, these stepped pyramids, but that are actually not a pyramid in the sense of the Egyptian form, we'll talk about later, but ones that are these mountains with then administrative office buildings on top of them, is one way to think about it. And they're also for the performance of sacred ritual, but not everybody gets to go inside these structures. And here's an actual aerial photograph of what it looks like. This is what it looked like about 60 years ago. And you can see, if you look closely, the outlines of some of these excavated structures and a whole bunch of the rest of it, which is unexcavated and heavily eroded. Because remember, a lot of this is constructed from baked mud brick. And 6,000 years and the desert sun and rain and erosion will do a number on a mud brick wall. But you can see the scale here. Absolutely huge, especially thinking that it's from over 6,000 years ago. This is the White Temple and Anu Ziggurat at Uruk. You can see a photograph of what it looks like from ground level, and then a reconstruction of what the building that would have sat atop this ziggurat would have looked like. And these ziggurats were the centers of the temple redistribution economy. And what it was is that rather than every village that surrounds the city being left to its own devices, is that they all had to pay into this centralized system. They had to pay tribute to the temple. They had to pay taxes to this structure. And so the goods and herds and whatnot, initially in the very early stages, are actually being physically brought into these temples. And so many of the early ones have large warehouses and storerooms associated with them. And these goods would be brought in, and then they would be redistributed out to places where they were needed. If one village was producing a lot of surplus that had a really great year, but another village had suffered a collapse of its irrigation canal and had flooded out its fields, and so that village needed more food, hadn't produced enough food for its people. This redistributive economy would move the goods from the place where they were in surplus to the place where they were lacking. And they would allocate labor. Instead of just each village working on the stuff within the village, they would often have to pay some of their debt to the temple, to the state, by labor. And rather than it just going on your farm in your village, oftentimes the labor itself would be one of the things that was redistributed. We need to repair the bridge over here. That's going to take priority over that. And so people would make decisions about that and say, okay, we're going to take all of the labor from these 5 villages, and we're going to fix the bridge at this one village. This is really one of the first times you have this scale of a redistributive economy going on. And we still have elements of this today, right? We pay taxes, and those taxes go to things other than what's right in our neighborhood. You pay taxes so that you can have the air traffic controllers at Ontario Airport. Even if you're not flying on a plane out of Ontario Airport, you're paying for the people that are helping those planes take off and land. And that's kind of the whole idea of a state-level political society, is that you can take this large system and you can move pieces around to where they're needed, not just, where they exist. Because otherwise, the Neolithic model seems, pretty reasonable. We can go back to that. So if you want to have a large-scale system and cities and markets and universities and international airports and all of that, there has to be some measure of this concept that was pioneered by the people in Mesopotamia of redistributing the resources that are produced in ways that make it all work, right? Here's a map of the Ayana complex in Uruk. You can see some of these really interesting kinds of pillared architecture here that have a lot of very elaborate rooms within them. And you can see the great courtyard for outdoor activities, and you can see a variety of different layouts to these things. And so there's different kinds of things going on here. Some of them are principally, for storerooms. Others are principally for ritual performances, while others seem to be more administrative in nature. This is a carved vase from Uruk, dating to between 3,500 and 3,000 BCE, or over 5,000 years old. And it's carved out of stone, alabaster. It's about 3 feet tall. And you can see represented here in the detail on the right a picture of the goddess Inanna receiving an offering, right? And this is kind of metaphorically what is going on in this structured system of the populations, not just of the city itself, but of the surrounding areas, offering their tribute to the temple, right? This is weaving together this political and economic structure with the belief systems of the time. Why should I pay the temple, this portion of my harvest? Well, because the gods, request that you do this. And it sort of shows how some of these early political systems were so interwoven tightly with the belief in the deities, with the belief in the supernatural, that it's difficult to completely extract these different components from one another. We talk today about as if these things are completely separate, but in other systems they have not been. And that's one of the things in the United States early on in its political history, the idea that there's a separation between church and state is one of the really pioneering political ideas of our system that distinguishes it from these ancient cities. But as you can imagine, as these systems work and work relatively well, they begin to expand and get larger and larger and larger. And it becomes impractical for all of the villages as these cities grow in their own population and grow in their territorial influence and control to physically bring everything into one temple, into one place, and then physically take it back out. It becomes impractical and inefficient. One of the technological innovations that happens as a direct result of a need to improve the administration of this economic system was the development of some of the earliest writing in the world, and a systematized and standardized system of writing that could be understood across these areas of its use. You didn't have to have a secret code book. People were able to read this when they were trained effectively. Who controlled the training and the knowledge of writing initially in Mesopotamia were the priests from these temples, and that further integrated that system into their ability to exercise political and economic influence within society. You can see here also how that writing system evolved through time, from one that was at least somewhat pictographic. You can see, oh, that's a fish. I can kind of recognize that as a fish, and sure, that looks like a star. I can see how that's water, right? You can see in that column there on the left vaguely what some of these things might be, especially grain, right? And then as the need to standardize and make it faster so that people can actually take notes and write quickly, you see a further and further abstraction of this system until you get to the Akkadian script of Akkad, early sort of ancestor to Babylon. By about 1800 BC, you have fully developed cuneiform that's based upon the pushing of a stylus into wet clay. That wet clay is then either dried or baked into a ceramic. The ones that are baked into a ceramic obviously is sort of making it permanent, laminating it, if you will. Whereas the ones that are just being used on baked clay can be recycled at some point. But this innovation has a huge impact because now you can create records. Now you can move information from one place to the next. Now people can communicate across space reliably, directly to one another rather than playing telephone and messengers and whatnot. Now information can be recorded and you can communicate across time. People can communicate to generations later. And this ability to record, preserve, and spread information was hugely impactful on the societies that adopted it. Some of the things that you begin to see are pretty remarkable. On the bottom left of this slide, you have a geometry exam that workers for the temples who needed to go out and measure the area of fields and the direction and angle and incline of irrigation canals and whatnot, they had to take this exam in order, and had to pass it in order to be able to have the job of being surveyors. And this is one of the textbooks for that you would study from for that exam. So this is one of the earliest examples of a geometry textbook, right? On the right here is actually the story of Atrahasis. If you read the Epic of Gilgamesh excerpts, this is the earliest known example of the story of the flood, of the idea in the book of Genesis of the Old Testament from the Abrahamic tradition. In this text, in one part it says, "Having been warned by a god that it will rain down upon you a profusion of fishes, the person Atrahasis, named here, built a strong ark amply caulked with pitch and rode out the catastrophe. We talked about this before at the end of the Neolithic lecture. This idea of this epic flood may be a relic from a memory of the Black Sea flood that happened in this region thousands of years earlier. And here it is in literary form for one of the first times. And this is the Stela of Hammurabi, one of the very first extensive cross-referenced law codes known in world history. And you can see the King Hammurabi receiving the blessing of one of the deities there, sort of, again, providing divine support and approval of these legal and political efforts by this earthly king here, providing that approval, blessing. And I've actually seen this physically in the flesh at the Louvre in Paris. And that's a whole discussion that we'll have later in class about why is something so important and central to Middle Eastern history and cultural heritage currently residing in Paris. We'll talk about that later. But some of the things that are really significant about the Law Code of Hammurabi. Think about this when you look at those texts that are posted there. What do the laws tell you about Babylonian society during the reign of Hammurabi? Is it an equal society? Is it something that where we're talking about, as in the Neolithic, a gender equality? Does everybody have the same rights? Does everyone have the same access to resources? Think about that as you look over it. What are some of the issues addressed by the various laws, right? Because if you're going to go to the trouble to construct this system of laws, it is usually, although not always, it is usually the case that people attempt to pass laws when they perceive there to be a problem with something. There is not currently a law specifically outlawing riding ostriches on the freeway here in California. Now, you could probably come up with some law that would cover that in the abstract, right? Well, you're causing a nuisance, you're obstructing traffic, all of that other stuff. But there's no law that specifically says ostriches, as a steed, are not approved for use on the freeways. Why might that be? Because that's never been a real problem, that we've had to deal with. And so think about that. Generally speaking, people are going to try to do these things. People are going to impose these laws when they perceive there to be a problem. So what are the issues that are on the minds of the people that are writing these laws? Remember, it's not necessarily the commoners that are putting forth these things, right? These are written by the bureaucrats and kings and judges and priests in these societies. And what are some of the general themes that the laws address? As I mentioned earlier, do the laws apply equally to all people? Something that's really, really key. And again, one way that, at least early in our political history, the idea was to rhetorically place this in there, but it has not generally been the case even in our country. Who enforces the law? What's the enforcement effect? You can have all the laws on the books, but if there's no way to enforce that, or if enforcement doesn't happen, then what does that mean for how serious of a legal precedent it is? And what is the basis for the law code? What is the legitimacy of this law code based upon? One of the things that is really key here that the cities of the Uruk period and their descendants in later centuries really pioneered was the development of the one of the very first examples of a world system, where you have these large, dense populations located in the river valleys of the Tigris and Euphrates that were drawing on surpluses from surrounding areas. But why are they able to draw on so much surplus from the surrounding areas? Well, what do they have in surplus? I mean, look at this map here. You can see all of these different resources on the map. Copper, marine shells, obsidian, semi-precious stone, silver, soapstone, tin, bitumen, tar, basically. There's maybe a little bit of tar in surface deposits to the west of Babylon, but really most of these resources are located outside of the actual river valley itself. So what does the river valley have? The river valley has water. The river valley has fertile soil and clay, right? So they can make ceramics. And what else can they make? With water and soil, you can make food. And if you can make a lot of food, what does that enable you to support? Large populations. Large populations then provide labor. And that labor can be used to produce, more food, but these smaller communities, many of them out in the surrounding areas of the mountain ranges of Anatolia and up into the Caucasus and what is today Iran and even into what is today Pakistan and the Sinai and the Levant. Many of them produce, quite a bit of their own food as well. They're not necessarily getting shipments of grain because that's really heavy and you don't get a whole lot of return on it. What are you going to trade? I'm going to trade you a bag of grain for, 2 goats. That's not going to be enough of a surplus benefit to support something like a city, right? So what is it? Well, these large labor pools, these large populations, lots of people, and using technological innovations and lots of water control and irrigation, state-run irrigation projects, they're able to produce a large enough surplus of food to support the city and then some, and still have some people left over. Well, what do you do with these people that are left over? Well, gives them time to do other stuff. Other stuff like what? Other stuff like I was talking about earlier. Learn to get really good at metalworking. Learn to get really good at carving shell and creating jewelry and these other manufactured goods, right? So these manufactured goods are being produced in these cities. And are they only sold within the city? No, that's what they're selling out into the hinterlands, because carrying out, a box full of precious stone jewelry, semi-precious stone jewelry, is a lot lighter and easier to carry than trying to haul out all that grain. And so you're actually able to get access to all of these raw materials, these valuable raw materials, because you're trading people not raw material for raw material, but you're trading them manufactured goods for raw material. And who always gets the better end of the deal when you're exchanging manufactured goods for raw materials? It's the people who are selling the raw materials are always going to get the short end of the stick on the exchange. You're never going to make the better end of that. So manufactured goods are what are being produced in these cities and are what are driving not just the surplus of agricultural production that the geographic area gives them, but now they've put themselves at the center of an economic system where they're trading manufactured goods for raw materials. And it puts them at a multiplier effect in terms of those exchanges. So every time one of those exchanges happens, they're getting a better end of the deal, and they're getting a better end of the deal, and they're getting a better end of the deal. And so the cities become wealthier and wealthier, and the hinterlands and these surrounding communities don't necessarily get the better end of the deal on these exchanges. It may benefit them in the sense that they get the manufactured goods. It may benefit them that they are able to then trade those to other people, but they're not the center. They're the periphery. They're the semi-periphery, depending upon how far out they are from the center of this system. And so you have the creation of one of the first examples of what we call today, in a larger planetary-wide system, we call it globalization. But this right here, this map, this is where that started. It didn't start in 1994 with NAFTA. It started right here. And you can see here a specific view of the Uruk world system with these specific archaeological finds of specific luxury goods and tablets and these hollow clay spheres that they used as essentially these documents of these exchanges. They were like invoices that you would send with the shipments to these different areas, and then when they got to the location, these bulla would be broken open, and there would be the records impressed on clay, tokens of how many bushels of grain should be in the shipment, how many manufactured boxes of manufactured goods should be in there, and then a comparable document of receipt would be sent back afterwards. And so they're showing these specific ranges of these different parts of the system that Uruk as a city was participating in at the time. The early dynasties of Mesopotamia include the Sumerians and the Akkadians, the Elamites, and only later do we have the founding of the famous city of Babylon. And in those opening pages of the Epic of Gilgamesh, you have that listing of different cities that talk about how this city was struck down by weapons and the kingship was carried to Ur, and then the kingship was carried to Uruk. And these are the different major cities of early Mesopotamia here on this map. This is an example of one of these major storehouses. As this system expands and becomes more and more and more central to the Mesopotamian system, you see the construction of more and more storehouses like this one, with restricted access to certain rooms for these valuable items that are controlled at the state level by the kings and at the temple level by the priesthood to support large-scale public works projects, to support armies, to support the construction of more palaces and temples in this system. This is the site, the archaeological site at the top, and then a reconstruction of the site of Kafaje, showing the temple, and then again these systems of walls. And you can see the town, the city, around these citadels, but you begin to get the idea that as this system progresses, you get increasingly restricted access, increasingly harder to go from the outside to the inside, and more control. And the more controlled the movement of people within a community is, the more you realize you have a highly unequal system, where certain people, it's not just that they have more, jewelry, it's not that they just have more food, they literally have more access to the centers of power than other people, and it's non-negotiable, right? There are more and more physical barriers going up at the same time that more and more social barriers are going up within these societies. Here's another aerial view of the site of Ur, just to show you, again, another example of one of the ziggurat temples, and then the complex architectural systems of these early cities. A site plan of just the central core, and you can see the larger one up there on the top left showing the outline of the city walls around Ur. The ziggurat of Ur Nammu at Ur, you can see the scale here. There's a person standing up there on one of the landings below the central stairway. These are massive, massive architectural investments on a scale that really at this point in history had never been seen on Earth. And here's one of the stela that was located there, showing the king, one of the gods actually here, seated in a throne. And down below, interestingly enough, you can see a procession of the workmen with the tools here that constructed this temple. And what's interesting is that there's complex messages being carried in a lot of this art that's very different from the art that we saw in so many of those Neolithic sites. You begin to see people represented at different scales. You begin to see not just gods, which is different from what we saw at many of the Neolithic sites, which was mostly centered on people or anthropomorphic abstractions. Now you begin to see representations of kings and artisans and workers and captives and slaves. You begin to see in these registers here a hierarchical system of society. And these are some of the royal tombs at Ur, which were incredibly revealing about that structure and the amount of wealth and the difference between the common burials, which are often simply the body of the individual without any adornment or goods, and these tombs with unbelievably rich materials. One in particular here is the burial of Queen Pu'abi, who not only was buried there herself with an incredible amount of wealth and a chariot and a horse to go with the chariot, but also her attendants, right? At the bottom, the last burial there at the bottom of the drawing is actually her personal harpist, her personal musician. And these people did not die of natural causes. They died because Queen Pu'abi died, and she needed them to take care of her in the afterlife. And so they were all executed and placed in her grave with her as her attendants into the afterlife. And so this notion of, taking it with you, very literally encompassed here, and to the point where you're not just taking goods and wealth with you into your tomb as a symbol of your status, but you are so much more important than the people who work in the palace. As this queen, the queen was so much more important, her life was so much more important than these people, that even when she dies, her needs in death outweighed their desire to stay alive. And so you want to talk about a example of inequality. This is par excellence. This is where these structures and systems of power and inequality and unequal distribution of resources, this is where this heads in a very rapid progression during the Bronze Age. Here's some of Queen Pu'abi's jewelry. This is her beaded cape made of coral and turquoise and malachite and gold. You can see some of the hairpins on the top left, bracelets and rings. And then this is her headdress here. The gold, interestingly enough, you say, well, how has that lasted so long? Iron and steel and copper will rust or corrode relatively quickly. Iron, worst of all. But gold actually does not rust, and so gold will survive for thousands of years after these other metals that we think of as being harder and more durable for cutting and as tools, sure, but in terms of resistance to the elements, gold is still one of the most resistant substances, and so that's one of the reasons why we have the preservation of some of this jewelry. And this is another example of something from the royal tombs at Ur, and this is the standard. It's this sort of wooden structure that's inlaid with lapis lazuli and ivory and other materials, and it shows on this side the army with chariots and foot soldiers in sort of combat array. On the bottom, you can see them driving the chariots over the enemies at the bottom there. And you can see them fighting people here in the middle register of this. And then on the peace side of the standard of Ur, you see all of these people working. You can see people at the top enjoying their cups of wine and beer, actually beer probably, and listening to music there. In the middle register, you can see people tending to herds of cattle, and in the bottom, you can see these merchants with their packs and pack animals. This is kind of the basis of wealth for this city, trade and herds of animals, and then you can see the upper levels of society enjoying the fruits of that productivity. One of the well-known artistic examples from these sites is this particular artifact, the ram in a thicket, made out of silver and gold and lapis lazuli, was one of the artifacts recovered from the royal burials at Ur. And it's a male sheep, ram, goat, in a thicket. And you can see the wool is done in silver, the horns and some of the beard done in lapis lazuli. An incredible example of both stone lapidary work and metallurgy. And it was from these small city-states at Eridu and Ur and Lagash and others that you had eventually the emergence of not just a state-level society, but one of the world's first empires. And that was the Akkadian Empire under Sargon, Emperor Sargon of Akkad. And this was where you had not just a state-level society centered on a single city, but the conquest or annexation of multiple previously independent cities under a single political system. And in many of these instances, it was conducted by military conquest. In others, it was achieved through intermarriage. But you had the formation of this first empire in the world, and this was the center of that, the idea of expanding the rule and subjugating previously independent political entities to the rule and authority of another. And that really is the core definition of an empire. And Sargon here was the first head of such an empire. Here is a contemporary representation of Sargon. How accurate, realistic, veristic, I should say, veristic the portrait is unknown, but this would be one of the world's first emperors. You can see here the development of that process led to larger scale conflicts than had existed before. The cities always fought with one another, but as multiple cities are now able to, or are now used as the sources for troops, now armies can get larger and larger, and the ambitions of these political rulers, enabled by these larger systems, these larger recruiting pools, expanded beyond just the river valleys of Mesopotamia into western Iran, into southeastern Turkey, into the Levant, into the Jordan River Valley, into the Sinai, and eventually led to conflicts directly between Imperial Egypt and the Mesopotamian states, between the Hittites of what is today Turkey and these states. And so you began to have competition between these neighboring empires. And so the scale of conflict gets larger and larger. And the instances of representation of conflict and captives and warfare become more and more frequent in the art as well. Here you can see some examples of the flip side of that stela we were looking at before, with charioteers and troops with large body-covering shields in close order formation. And so the nature of conflict and warfare begins to change. Here you can see a detail of that previous one showing the king and all of the captives that the king has taken. And you'll note, metaphorically, they're shown as very small individuals compared to the king himself. They weren't actually smaller. It's a artistic license.